I want us to get us all on the same picture. I want us to realise that when we look at something and read something, if we don't read it in context, we can often miss the importance of that subject. I also wanted to give you faith that when you read through, you can see things different to what I actually bring out. And I hope that through this study that you've realised some different methods that we can use to understand more of what the passage is telling us and to get it in its context. You know, there's one of the reasons why we have so many different churches out there today is because we often don't look at the context of what it's saying. We bring out what we want it to say. And I've said this many times to my Bible students before, I can actually get the Bible to say that it's good for me to kill you. And they sort of look at me a bit bluntly. Well, I said, well, I read over here that Cain killed his brother Abel, and I read over here in the New Testament that Jesus says, go and do likewise. So I can make the Bible say whatever I want it to say if that is my desire, but my desire is to see what the book is actually telling us and to look at its context and look at the overall theme and to put it in place. And when we do, we will see things that are super special. And I have certainly enjoyed Missa, Isaac's, Jared's and others who have done some of these chapters and see what they have actually brought out on the chapter and how it might be different to what I might bring out. But today we're going to look at Matthew 26, and I believe the overall arching theme of Matthew 26 is a contrast between God's ways and man's ways. That's not up on the screen, is it? I wonder if that's because of something that I have done. I think it is. I'll see if I can fix that up. Yep, that should be okay. Oh yes, there it is. So I believe the overarching theme of Matthew 26 is God's ways versus man's ways. We're going to see a number of contrasts between these events that happen in Matthew 26. And as we go through, I hope that it'll give us a picture that God's ways are far more attractive than man's ways. You know, when I think about it and I think about the reason why many people around the world don't commit to God and don't commit to his ways is simply because they see God as not attractive. Would you agree with that? Put up your hand if you agree with that. And why do they see God as not attractive? They see God as not attractive because they don't understand who he is or they don't understand his governance. I'll tell you a little story about that to finish with later on. But I want to begin by why we do communion. Why do we actually do communion? And that story, I mean, that answered all the questions. It sort of makes my answers look very insignificant to what that story did. And I thank you for that, Jared. But I would rather that come afterwards now than before. But you know, Jesus here at communion was standing between two economics periods, two great festival periods. He was standing between the Passover and communion, between these two different economic ways of dealing with things and looking at things. But he was everything that the earthly sanctuary pointed towards. He was the bread of life. He was the water of life. He was the sacrificial lamb that was to die in our place. And we see that the disciples and those that Jesus was dealing with in the 3.5 years that he was doing his ministries misunderstood what a Messiah was. They misunderstood who Jesus was and what a Messiah was. They thought that a Messiah was a conquering Messiah. They thought that a Messiah was going to defeat the Romans and set themselves up in an earthly kingdom, and that the Jews again would be the number one nation of the world. And they were really looking forward to that. And when Jesus died, It sort of destroyed a lot of people's faith. But here he was standing between these two economies, between these two main thoughts, and he wanted his disciples to see the importance of not only the Passover, but this new service that he was going to instigate. So why do we do communion? Well, some say it's just a ceremony we do. And many of the Jewish festivals had just become ceremonies that people do, and they lost sight of what it was. Well, some might say, well, I just turned up and communion was on. Did you know that communion was on, Tanya? No, so you've just turned up here not prepared for communion. So some just turn up and go, oh, what's this communion all about? So they might partake of it for that reason. Some might say, well, it's the right thing to do. Some might see it as their ticket into heaven. And some might say after the lesson this day, it reminds me of Jesus. And I've got during this service. I've got during this service because I want to challenge you that this is a very sacred service. This is a time for us to remember, for a time for us to reflect. But when we leave those doors there afterwards to the sermon, how often do we actually think and remember what we have, the importance of what we have just partaken of? So I want us to think about that question, why do communion? Why do communion? So let's have a look at what Matthew 26 reveals to us. So I'll get you to open your Bibles with me. Matthew chapter 26. I think if I stay over this side, it echoes less. So I'm going to stay this side. So sorry about you people over there. But Matthew chapter 26, and verse 1 begins with, "And it came to pass when Jesus had finished these sayings that he said to his disciples." So in other words, he'd finished the sayings that were said from Matthew 24 right through to Matthew chapter 25. And this is basically like a new start, a new chapter here. And he begins by saying, "You know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up and to be crucified." This is a theme that happens from chapter 16 on. Jesus is telling and retelling and retelling and retelling his disciples of the events that are going to come. And the events that are going to come at the Passover. While we're looking at these events that are coming, and while Jesus is trying to focus his disciples on these events so they are prepared for what is about to happen, we find in verse 3, "Then the chief priests, the scribes and the elders and the people assembled at the place of the high priest, who is called Caiaphas, and plotted to take Jesus by trickery and to kill him. But they said, 'Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people.'" Here Matthew 26 begins with this contrast. Have you seen it? Jesus is saying, "I'm going to die and it's going to be at the Passover." But we find the chief priests preparing to take him by trickery and to put him to death, but not at the Passover. So we get this contrast of man's ways versus God's ways. God knew that it had to be at the Passover for them to understand that he was the Passover lamb. For them to understand and put the pieces together and to remember the significance of what was about to take place. So we find that this contrast, that while Jesus is preparing to give life, they're plotting to take life. Giving life, taking life. Giving life by giving of himself, taking life for the benefit of themselves. This contrast between Jesus and the leaders of the church. Then we have this story of the anointing at Bethany. And one thing that often troubled me in the past was verse 13, where it said, "Assuredly I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her." And I remember thinking, well, I'm not hearing a lot about this woman, but this must have been a huge significant thing for this woman to be spoken of by Jesus in this way. And it made me think, well, maybe I'm not getting the importance of what has actually happened here. So let's have a look at this story with that in mind. In verse 6 it says, "And Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper." We find that he really brings out that Simon is a leper. That Simon had been healed by Jesus. We find the woman came to him having an alabaster flask of very costly fragrant oil, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when his disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this fragrant oil might have been sold for much and given to the poor." But when Jesus was aware of it, he said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a good work for me." And then Jesus said another thing that sort of troubled me for a while. He said, "For you have the poor with you always." Was Jesus saying that we shouldn't help the poor? I see only a couple of people shaking their heads. Was Jesus saying we shouldn't help the poor? Was Jesus saying at times we shouldn't help the poor? You know, when you look at this response, this is actually a mild rebuke to the disciples. Here we find an unnamed woman, and the interesting thing is when you look at this account in the other Gospels, the other Gospel writers actually name who instigated this disgust amongst the disciples, and that was Judas. But Judas isn't talked about until next, and that's why the reason why I believe this is because Matthew wants us to see this contrast between this woman and Judas. So let's have a look at this woman. This woman, we know by reading the other Gospels, we know that this woman had gone to great lengths to buy this perfume. This perfume would have cost her an enormous amount of money. I don't know how she got that enormous amount of money to be able to buy this, but an alabaster flask is a flask that's actually shaped out of a soft stone, and the fragrant oil that went into this alabaster flask would have actually probably come from a root that was taken from up high in northern India, up in the Himalayas, and extracted from a root up there. So a tree had to die for this fragrant oil to be actually implemented. This is part of the reason why this would have been such an expensive flask of oil. And she had gone to great lengths to do this, and she had gone at great lengths to do this, Jesus tells us, because it was for his burial. But if it was for his burial, why is she doing it right now? The reason why she's doing it right now is because she was hearing the talk around the town. She understood from Jesus' own words that he was going to die. And then she started to hear of all the other talk amongst the disciples, amongst the other leaders, and she's thinking to herself, maybe I've got it wrong. Maybe he is coming as the king. And Jesus' triumphant entry just a few days earlier, or a day earlier, to this event showed that he was going to be elevated as a king. And they struggled, and she struggled with this and thought, I better anoint him now, and if it's not anointing for his death, it's an anointing for his kingship. And so at this home of Simon, she had the opportunity, and she broke this flask. These flasks were something that might be handed down also from family generations. If you had one of these flasks, it's like your future was secure. It's like you had a gold bar or for us today, we'd have money tied up in shares or in superannuation or whatever to secure our future. This was something that was handed down to people. And this jar was sealed with this solid wax that would go into the top of it, and the only way that this could be opened was by breaking the jar. When you broke the jar, you had to use all of it. It's not like today, ladies, you get out that bottle that's been sitting on your bathroom shelf and you do a little bit of a spray and it's still going to be there tomorrow to spray it and the next day and the next day and the next day, and depending how long, it might last you for 3 months or more. It's not like that. When you broke it, you had to use the whole lot. And we find that this woman didn't worry about the cost at all. Jesus was worth every single penny of it. So we find that she broke it and the smell immediately began to permeate the room. And we find the people having a go at this lady. And then in verse 14, we have this contrast between this woman and Judas. In verse 14 it said, "Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, 'What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?' And they counted out 30 pieces of silver. So from that time he sought opportunity to betray Jesus." Now when I look at this unnamed woman, compared to a named disciple, and not just any named disciple, this was Judas. This was the one that the disciples thought to themselves, he's probably the greatest amongst us. He was the smartest. He was the keeper of the treasury. He had it all together. And they probably aspired a little bit to be like him. And when they were wanting the positions, one on the left and one on the right, they were hoping they were getting to Jesus before Judas got to him, because they thought Judas might take that place. But here we start to realise the true character of Judas. The true character of Judas, a person who had walked with Jesus for probably around 3.5 years of his life. And through that walking with Jesus, got to witness the miraculous things that he had done. And all he was concerned about was securing his future. What will you give me? The more that he could get, the more he could look after self. We know from John's account that Judas wanted money to come into the treasury so he could take a bit off for himself. But here it tells us, and Matthew portrays it in this contrast between this unnamed woman, who we know from the other accounts is Mary, but I believe that Matthew left her unnamed for a reason. And here we have Judas, this prominent Judas. But we see in all this, the disciples were having a go at this woman. And I love the way that Matthew does this. He doesn't leave himself out. He adds himself in by adding the disciples rather than just specifically taking Judas out. They were a party to it because they allowed it to go on. They agreed with it. Although they might not have outwardly spoken it, they were a party to it. But when we look at it, this woman, this unnamed woman, was the only one who really understood what Jesus was about to do. The next contrast, and when I say the next contrast, there are many more contrasts, but I'm only focusing on these 5 contrasts. The next contrast, we see that Jesus, in verse 26, as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then in verse 27, he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." Here we find that Jesus is offering a cup that we're going to drink of today, which is a cup of connectedness. But we find a contrast between the cup that Jesus is offering his disciples and the cup that he himself was about to drink. Let's take a look. Over in verse 38 it says, "Then he said to them, 'My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me.' He went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but your will be done. In verse 42, he again says, if this cup cannot pass away from me, unless I drink it, your will be done. And verse 44 revealed that he prayed that same prayer again the third time. Jesus here is contrasted drinking a different cup to what we get to drink. This contrast between the two cups, between the cup of connectedness and the cup of separation. So we also see this contrast. We see another contrast that I skipped over in verse 22, where it says, and they were exceedingly sorrowful, and each of them began to say, Lord, it is I. They were exceedingly sorrowful because they were in the upper room. They were partaking of this service, and there was a solemnness about what was happening in this service. They were understanding of what was about to happen, and they could see that Jesus was deep in thought and had something deep on their mind. And then he reveals that someone was going to betray him. And when he shared that, they started to examine themselves, and they thought to themselves, well, I hope it's not me. And one by one, they came to Jesus and said, Lord, it is I. Lord, is it I? Lord, is it I? And they'd all come before Jesus asking the very same question, bar one person. And John, at last we know from John's account, he leaned over onto Jesus' breast and he said to him, who is it, Lord? Who is it? None of them suspected Judas at this time. They're all looking at others. And Jesus says, he who dipped his hand with me in the dish will betray me. And then we find in verse 25, then Judas, who was betraying him, answered and said, Rabbi, is it I? It's like by this time, all the disciples had gone through, Judas hadn't said anything, and then the eyes started to go onto Judas, and Judas goes, whoa, I better ask the same question, or else I'm going to be looked at as the one that's going to betray him. But Matthew puts something different from it here for us. Did you pick it up? What did the disciples say? The disciples said, Lord, is it I? What did Judas say? Rabbi, is it I? This shows the difference and the different understandings that they thought of Jesus. Their attitude was that although they didn't understand what was happening, Jesus was still their Lord. But to Judas, he was just the teacher. He hadn't given his life over to him as Lord. And so we find this contrast between this. The last contrast I want to talk about this morning is found over in verse 52. And like I said, this is not the last contrast. There's probably about 20 contrasts in this chapter. But in 52 it says, but Jesus said to him, this is just after that Judas had betrayed Jesus. This was just after that event. And then they saw these Pharisees and this group coming with swords and clubs. Peter said to Jesus, even if I have to die with you, I will not leave you. And here these people come, and Peter got out his sword, and it said he chopped off the ear of the servant of the high priest. Now, I don't know about you, but you reckon he said, I'm going to try and get his ear off like that? I'm telling you, he was going for his head. He was going to take his head off. He was going to fight to the death. And he swung his sword violently at this man. And I can imagine this man ducking, and just ducked in time, and off went his ear. And what did Jesus say? Jesus said, put your sword away. Put it back in its place. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword. In other words, he was giving them a principle here. If you're going to do battle that way, you will end up dying that way as well. And then in verse 53 he says, "Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels?" In other words, Jesus is saying, hey, I have the ability to fight this way, but I'm choosing not to. Ever thought of why 12 was called out? 12 legions of angels? 12 tribes of Israel? He could have called more than 12, so he would have had a greater army than the army of Israel who were trying to capture him. But Jesus said, I don't do things that way. My governance is not about that way. If God's governance was about that way, none of us here would be alive here today. Do you agree? We would have been wiped out long ago. Lucifer would have been wiped out himself. But God doesn't govern that way. He governs by giving of himself. So here we see these contrasts, these amazing contrasts in this passage. And the communion service reveals so much more. It's interesting that the lesson was talking about today remembering. And this is all about remembering. Remembering, I believe, 4 main things. There's plenty more things we could remember, but 4 main things. Remembering, firstly, God's love for each and every one of us. Remembering how God governs. Remembering his true character, which helps us to remember how attractive God is. You know, when I go and do studies on a daily basis, I find some people it's hard to get them to see and make decisions for God. And a few weeks ago I was wrestling with this thing of how can I get these guys to make decisions for God. There was one that we'd been studying with for 2 years, and when I said, are you ready to make a commitment? Are you ready to consider baptism and to dedicate your life to God? And he says, I'm just not sure. I'm just not sure. I had another guy that had started paying tithe and then he stopped and he says, well, things got a little bit tight. The budget, I had things going wrong with my car and other things, and I decided that, I just can't afford it this week, and then he couldn't afford it next week, and then he ended up stopping paying his tithe. And I was thinking, how do I address this? How do I get to him to see the importance? I shouldn't say give tithe, I should say return tithe, because it's not ours in the first place, is it? And God tells us we're actually robbing him if we don't return it. And I'm thinking, how can I get him to see that? And there was this other guy that was struggling with drugs and not being able to make decisions for God and his ways. And I thought, what can I do for these 3 guys this week? And I come to the conclusion that for those 3 guys, God and his ways were not attractive enough. That was the simple equation, that God was not attractive enough. So I looked at ways that I could make God more attractive to them, to help them to understand why God puts these things in place. And everything is for our own benefit. He wants to bless us if we return to him. He wants to make sure that we will be okay. He wants us to trust and have faith in him. You know, we go to different things because it gives us an immediate hit to alcohol or other things because we get an instant gratification, but we're not prepared to look at the eternal gratification and the eternal peace that it brings for us through making God's ways. And so I challenged these guys and praise God, only this week one of the guys come to me and he said, hey, I want you to put this in the tithe this week. And he said, well, I want you to put it in. He said, no, I don't trust myself. I want you to put it in. He wanted me to have it right then and there. And another guy come and told me that he'd cut right back and he was working on completely getting rid of his addictions. And you can do that through God, through the strength that he gives us, through the decisions that we make and the strength that God gives us as well. But I realised that I had to do that by making God and his ways attractive. And when we look at communion, communion is about that. Communion is about reminding us of God's love for us, about God's governance, about his true character, and about how attractive he is. So as we partake of this service, my prayer for each single one of us is that we will see God for who he truly is, the attractive God that has our best interests at heart. Thank you.